You're listening to Killcliff's Hazard Ground podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's story about a former Army captain turned aspiring author who looks at the lighter side of war. We'll tell you about that more in a moment, but just a few reminders to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you are watching this podcast on our YouTube channel, we appreciate you subscribing as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the Killcliff YouTube channel and download the Killcliff TV app. You can get all of our podcasts through Killcliff there as well. Don't forget about our promotion with Amazon. You can go to our website, hazardground.com, and click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab. Same thing on your smartphone. It's very user-friendly because it'll redirect you right to the app. So go to hazardground.com on your smartphone, get redirected to the Amazon app. You do all your normal Amazon shopping. Whatever you spend, we'll get a percentage of that number, and then we donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations that have been featured here on the Hazard Ground. So you can literally donate to veterans causes just from your couch, from your smartphone, wherever you are. It's a simple, easy way to do your part to help out veterans all across America. Don't forget as well to help us out with our Apple Podcast reviews, trying to crack the top 100 Apple Podcasts. We need more reviews and your help to do it. Doesn't have to be a lengthy review. Just give us 5 stars. Tell us what you like about the show. And you can tell how much you like the host. I mean, that never hurts. It's always good to do that as well. But in all seriousness, if we can get more of those, we can help grow this Hazard Ground community and certainly get these stories told to more and more people. Now on to this week's guest, who is, again, a retired Army captain who had one deployment to Afghanistan, turned aspiring author, and he wrote a book named Kilroy Was Here, which is basically a humorous look at the absurdities of modern warfare. He has 2 other short stories that have both been published on Amazon, and he is Brett Allen joining us here on the Hazard Ground podcast. Brett, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's funny. I had found you on Twitter and then just started stalking you a little bit and everything that you had done. And I'm like, this is like a good story. I mean, look, we spend a lot of time with serious subjects here on the podcast, and with good reason. There's a lot of things to discuss, but anytime we can look at the lighter side of warfare that puts a smile on our face, we're certainly willing to do that. And your book has been wildly successful. Again, Kilroy Was Here is the title. So we thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always looking for ways to plug the book, so this is awesome.
All right, so start back at the beginning. How and why you signed up for the Army?
Okay. Well, I was a senior in high school when September 11 happened. I remember the office assistant coming into my senior studies class and announcing that a plane had just hit the World Trade Center. Kind of like everybody else, we thought it must have been some type of mistake, navigation error, something like that. But then when the second plane hit and then news of the Pentagon came in, it was clear that wasn't the case. I thought about enlisting right there out of high school, but I had already been accepted to Michigan State. My parents had encouraged me to kind of let those high emotions of the time settle and go get some school in first. So that's what I did. I went to Michigan State. I remember sitting in my dorm room in March of 2003, watching the gear up and then the invasion of Iraq. And just kind of thinking, what am I doing here? Why those guys, not me? I had friends from high school that had joined the Army and the Marines, and I knew that they were on their way over there. So I got kind of restless again. I switched my major like 7 times between freshman and sophomore year, twice that in my head. And I just couldn't seem to figure out what I wanted to do, but the military kept calling back. So I thought about dropping out of college and enlisting again. But my dad found this 2-year ROTC program at Michigan State where you do kind of like a catch-up program at Fort Knox during the summer. So I spent a month at Fort Knox going through this catch-up program.
Good old basic camp at Fort Knox.
Exactly. It was like a condensed basic training. We were the first class that actually had drill sergeants. So previous years, it was like kind of a hug fest. But the year we were there, they were like, we're going to see how they handle like the actual pressures of basic training. So we got the whole the shark bowl when we got there, and it was an experience. And then right from there, I actually lucked out, got a slot to airborne school, and ended up going through airborne school as a civilian, which I'm not sure anybody really knew about at the time. But came back, finished my 2 years at ROTC, and then commissioned as an armor officer.
So when you were going through basic camp, you clearly had no preconceived notion about the military at that point in time. Was there any part of you that thought maybe this wasn't such a good idea?
Yeah, there was a big part of me that thought that. I'd seen Full Metal Jacket at that point, so I was familiar.
That was your only frame of reference, huh?
Yeah, I was familiar.
Arlie Emery not setting a very good example.
I was familiar with the whole drill sergeant scene, and then I remember sitting in this room with all the other cadets on the first day, and this captain comes in, and he's like, "I'm the last person that's going to be nice to you for the next 28 days. So once I walk out this door, you're going to meet your drill sergeants, and it's game on." And then he walked out and left us sitting there for like 5 minutes, let us stew on it for a few minutes, and then the drill sergeants came running in, and it was pretty much what I had imagined it would be based off the Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah, that 5 minutes must have felt like hours.
Yeah.
Physically, were you in like shape for the whole thing? I mean, was there anything physically about basic camp that sort of daunted you?
Not really. I was a cross country runner in high school. I continued with the running, did a couple marathons, and went into basic training, or not, I won't call it basic training, that's an insult to basic training, but I went into the month-long pansy basic training with pretty good legs under me, so I was good.
Yeah, and so like it's weird. I remember going through ROTC. It was always the fast runners who stood out to everybody. It didn't matter if you could do 300 push-ups. It didn't matter if you could do 500 sit-ups. The fast runners always got all the clout. Like it was just one of those things where, and I wasn't slow, but I wasn't fast. And so I was always jealous of those dudes who automatically got put in good leadership positions and everything else because they could run. Nobody was chasing me. So what the hell am I running for?
Yep. That was the one thing I made sure that I maintained was the running. I remember getting to my unit at Fort Drum, went out on a run with the commander and two of the other lieutenants on like the third day and just crushed them on a 6 mile run. And from there on out, I had the respect of the commander and the other lieutenants. So
yeah, kiss ass. Did you know that you wanted to be an armor officer? How did that work out for you?
I was back and forth between armor and infantry. I just knew that I wanted to be combat arms. My grandpa was a ranger in World War II. He was one of Darby's Rangers, B Company. So that kind of played a pretty big part in my wanting to serve. He was my first salute when I commissioned into the armor branch. So he used to give me a ton of crap about being an officer, though, because he was a private first class.
That's pretty funny. I neglected to say this at the beginning, but you only spent 4 years in. And I wonder, all that sort of, whole emotion that you had and wanting to be on the front lines and everything else. When you look back on that and reflect, do you think that there was any immaturity in that notion back then? I mean, I get it, hindsight's 2020. I guess what I'm kind of driving at, I mean, if another war breaks out theoretically, and it's your kids down the road who want to do that, would you advise them to pick combat arms and get to the front lines as quick as possible? Or do you think that's just a lot of bravado for an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of bravado, but I think I'd also have the understanding of wanting to do that. I don't know. I think that at that time, I kind of knew what I was getting into, but like you said, you have the cocky confidence of being 18, 19. I guess when I commissioned, I was 22. So, but still, you think you're bulletproof and you don't have anything anchoring you down. So it's kind of a nothing to lose situation. But being a parent now, I would probably try to sway my kids in the other direction.
Yeah. In the rear with the gear seems just fine, right?
Yep.
I kid. So you get commissioned. You head off to Fort Drum, 10th Mountain Division. How quickly do you end up deploying from there?
Well, actually, I was supposed to go to 173rd Airborne. I was going to go to their cavalry regiment out of Schweinfurt, Germany. And we had 4 lieutenants at Armor Officer Basic that were supposed to go there. And when we got there, like 2 weeks into Officer Basic, we got orders, changing our orders. 2 of us got sent to Fort Knox, or staying at Fort Knox. And then 2 guys got sent to JRTC down in Fort Polk. I was one of the guys that stayed at Fort Knox, and I ended up serving a year as a basic training XO with 515 Cav. It was a cool assignment. I mean, obviously not an ideal assignment for a guy who's in a combat arm branch and wants to get to a unit, but I got to work with a lot of great people. I'm still in contact with a lot of the drill sergeants that I worked with there, and I mean, those guys are outstanding. They were all coming off from Iraq deployments. They were kind of in like a decompression phase. So I got to hear a lot of interesting stories about their deployments, about the invasion of Iraq. And it was just I mean, it wasn't useful stuff from a job standpoint for getting to my unit, but it was useful stuff from a life experience and battle experience, getting to hear those stories.
Were you nice to all the privates there after the way you were treated at basic camp? Were you a little bit nicer, a little bit more gentle, or did they tell you had to be a hard ass?
I tried to follow the battle rhythm of the basic training cycle. And I mean, I wasn't very nice at the beginning, but I also didn't want to step on any drill sergeant toes. So I kind of hung towards the back. But at the end of the cycle, when the drill sergeants ease up, that's when I had the most fun, because I got to go out and do some of the lanes they did, and be a walker and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a similar experience. It was only for about a month, but right after I commissioned, I didn't have a report date to my first assignment at Fort Hood for about 30 or 40 days. And so instead of just, actually not getting in the Army, I signed in and was the XO of the AIT company at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where I was set to do my basic course because I was an ordnance officer at the time. And I had that same experience as you did, working with all the privates and everything. And I remember being just so floored. Like every time I walked into a room, all these kids stood up and snapped to attention. I'm like, dude, I'm like a day older than you. And I've been in the Army exactly 5 less weeks than you have. Like it was just something that always stood out as weird to me. And I don't know if you felt the same way. It was just one of those things where, as a 21-year-old kid, 22-year-old kid, you don't really grasp that whole thing yet. At least I didn't, because I didn't have a lot of military experience like you. Like I had, obviously I had a grandfather who was in World War II, I had a stepfather in Vietnam and everything else, but I just didn't have that sort of background about the military. Was that a weird experience for you and all that?
A little bit. We had a pretty wide range of people coming in. At that time, it was 2007. So the Army was pretty much accepting anybody that had a heartbeat.
A heartbeat and half a brain, right?
Yeah. We had one guy come in that, I don't remember what the cutoff age was at the time, but he was right there. He had 2 sets of dentures and neck tattoos and the whole 9 yards. Like,
wow.
Anybody that can make it made it in. And so it was kind of weird, because I had all these 18, 19-year-old guys who were, just a couple years younger than me, but I also had these older guys who had been floating around for a long time and came in. So they were 10 years my senior, but just trying to make their way through. But it always floored me the way you could separate who was going to be the good soldiers and who were going to be the bad soldiers within the first 2 weeks. I mean, you see the leadership starting to come out in the guys that are born with it. And then
just like ROTC, but on the other side of the ledger. Yeah. I mean, you knew who the dummies were, and they showed themselves on the college campus every day. You mentioned earlier about when you went through basic camp, there was a party at the beginning who thought that you might have made a mistake. When you heard some of the stories from those guys who were coming back and everything else, and you were all, gung ho, let's go to combat. Did any of that sort of unnerve you a little bit, or was it you sort of maybe even excited you a little bit more?
A little of both. I think if you hear stuff like that and it doesn't make you a little bit nervous, you're probably a liar. You know, you hear that stuff and you swallow it, and you know that that's why you signed up in the first place. So you kind of put your head down and drive on, because that's what you're there to do. I guess for me, it was more just seeing the way those guys had processed it. For me, that was kind of my concern, was how am I going to handle this? What's my reaction to combat going to be? And to see those guys come out of it and tell the way they handled it and things like that was more helpful than actually hearing the stories about the combat itself.
All right. So when do you get to Fort Drum?
Fort Drum was December of 2007.
Okay.
So I got to Fort Drum and took over a platoon in Cherokee Troop 371 Cav with 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain. And I was there for about 6 months, 7 months. Before I left Fort Knox, I had done a spur ride and blown out my knee. So I was carrying some guy out of a building. We were doing one of our last exercises for the spur ride, and my knee buckled in the wrong direction. And the Army doctors at Fort Knox told me my knee bones were fine after they x-rayed them. And then I got to Fort Drum and had another series of issues where the knee gave out, ended up getting an MRI, and they told me my ACL was completely severed. So about 6 months at Fort Drum, I ended up having a knee surgery, and then ended up on squadron staff. And that's kind of what ended up inspiring Kilroy Was Here, was the time on staff.
Interesting. First of all, what's a spur ride? I'm not an armor officer, something with your spurs, obviously, but what is it? This goes over my head. You guys wear Stetsons and spurs, and it's just weird.
We like to play dress up.
Yeah, exactly.
So spur ride it's like it varies in duration, but the one we did at Fort Knox was 48 hours long, and you're doing constant tests, proficiency tests. It's kind of like earning your EIB for an infantryman. We ended up doing proficiency tests and then ending with this sticks lane in an urban mount site, and that's where I blew out my knee. But at the culmination of the spur ride, you earn a pair of silver spurs, which you can't get unless you do a spur ride. If you deploy with a cavalry unit, then you get a pair of gold spurs, but you can only get the silver through a spur ride.
So no horses involved, though?
No horses. They had horses at the ceremony for the one they did at Fort Drum, but we didn't have any at Knox.
Side note, have you ever actually ridden a horse while in uniform?
Not in uniform. I have not.
All right. Just making sure that wasn't part of the whole experience. Were you upset that they sort of misdiagnosed your knee?
A little bit. They were very
passive.
Yeah. So it happened towards the end of the day. On the day that it happened, I finished out the spur ride because I had come too far and wasn't going to go home. So then as soon as the spur ride was done, they took me over to the hospital. The night staff there gave me x-rays, and there was some doctor on duty who basically said I was fine. If I wasn't, then to come back in a month. And by the time that month was up, I was already at Fort Drum. So I just kind of let it go. I was able to run and whatnot. But every once in a while, if I turned my leg wrong, my knee would give out and I'd go down. So we were running a sticks lane at Fort Indiantown Gap at a field training exercise.
Very familiar with the Gap.
Yes. I love that place.
Good old Pennsylvania, baby.
So our squadron commander was walking our lane while I was running this platoon attack, and we were coming around to assault the objective, and my knee buckled. I went down, and he was like, "Holy crap! Like, I heard that pop from back here. You're going to see a doctor." So I ended up getting a MRI scheduled, and they were like, "I can't believe you've been walking around on this for 6 months." So
wow. Were you sort of angry and frustrated as well about, hey, I signed up and wanted to be on the front lines, and so far I've spent 2+ years and I haven't even sniffed it?
A little bit. It was a lot of sour grapes when I first got the order changed from the 173rd. Like that was my dream assignment, and coming out of ROTC, I couldn't believe it. I lucked out because I was going to a cavalry unit and I was going to an airborne unit, which were the two things that I had wanted. So yeah, I was a little ticked off. It lightened it a little bit. That's one of my buddies from Michigan State. He was a armor officer too. We both got assignment to the 173rd, and we both got our orders changed at the same time to stay at Fort Knox. So I at least got to stay with somebody I knew. We ended up living together while we were there, and it ended up being a fairly decent time. And the funny thing is the 173rd Airborne unit that I was supposed to go to ended up being the ones that relieved us in Afghanistan when we left at the end of 2009.
Oh, there you go. So rehab goes on, and you're on staff. Now, do you actually deploy while you're still sort of on the mend?
Yeah, I was out of my brace and everything by the time we deployed. About a month prior to deployment, I was able to get the brace off and start jogging again. Mm-hmm. So I was able to do most things. I remember I was ended up a little overweight when I got to Bagram. So started running the outer loop of Bagram as many times as I could before we ended up going forward to our fob. And I ended up dropping like 25-30 pounds while I was in Afghanistan. So ended up good. I was in pretty great shape when I got back.
Now, you said they moved you up to staff. They moved you up to staff just because you got injured?
We had another lieutenant come in, and they didn't really have another spot for him, another platoon available, and I was hobbling around the squadron area, so they decided to throw me up to the squadron operations office.
That's kind of like a jerk move.
That's what I thought.
Okay. I mean, did you raise any hell with it with your squadron commander?
Not with my squadron commander. He wasn't a very personable person. So I went to my troop commander, who he was an awesome troop commander. Unfortunately, there was just nothing he could do about it. I'd been there for 6 months, and I was among the oldest of the platoon leaders there. I was about to make captain in another 6 months, so they decided to take me up. I think the year in Fort Knox kind of screwed me, because by the time this all came into play, I was, like I said, getting ready to make captain, while most of the other platoon leaders were getting ready to make first lieutenant.
Got it. Okay. So you mentioned you get to Bagram. Do you know where you're going, what fob you're going to, what your mission is when you get there?
Yeah, we spent a lot of late nights at Fort Drum planning everything out, being in the operations office. We actually were originally slated to go to Iraq, but then we got, in August of 2008, we got diverted and sent to Afghanistan. So we had loads and loads of hours just in the operations room at Drum planning the movement to Bagram, and then from Bagram down to Fob Altamar in the Logar province, which was, if I remember correctly, about 80 kilometers south of Kabul, I think. Mm-hmm. So we had a movement that went from Bagram through Kabul, and then down Highway 1 into Logar to Fob Altamar.
And what was your job on staff?
Well, when I got there, I was supposed to be a battle captain. That's where they were going to throw all the extra lieutenants, apparently. Mm-hmm. But then when we got there, they realized they didn't have anybody coordinating air operations. So they told me I was the S3 Air, is what they called it. And I asked them, how am I supposed to do that. I've never worked with helicopters. And the ops sergeant major pointed to a couple of Apaches landing over on the Bagram airstrip, and he was like, go ask those guys. So that's what I did. I went to the airstrip. I started asking questions, figured out who the liaison was from our brigade headquarters, went and talked to him, and just kind of pieced it together as we went. I spent about a month at Bagram, moving people to FOB Baltimore. I didn't get to go on the ground movement, but I had to coordinate a lot of people and equipment movement from Bagram to FOB Baltimore. And then once we got there, I was in charge of planning the recon missions for the Apaches that were attached to us, and a lot of resupply missions. We set up quite a few outposts and cops while we were there.
So what's day-to-day life like for you? I mean, you're basically walking into the operations center and hanging out there all day, right?
Yes.
Not what you had signed up for.
Not what I had signed up for.
Right.
Fortunately, I was able to at least make myself useful on the airfield. It was kind of given to me as my thing to run. So I had a couple of really good NCOs that had deployed with the unit in 06 when they had set up Cop Keating and some other outposts. And
so you're to blame for that whole mess then?
No, but I'm good friends with a couple guys that Jake Tapper had interviewed for the Outpost book. So it was kind of interesting to read that book and see some familiar
we
names.
have told several of those stories, so we might have some cross paths there.
Yeah.
So check out any of our Cotton Keating stories. But anyway, I'm sorry. I just, had to poke some fun at you, but go ahead. I apologize.
No worries. It ended up being a lot of fun on the nights when we were doing aerial resupply missions or air assault missions, because I got to basically go around the airfield. And when we were doing resupply missions, especially, I would always help out with the sling loads and hook and loads on the bottom of the helicopters. So, I mean, if I couldn't experience combat, at least I got to have the Chinooks hovering 2 feet over my head with the potential for being crushed to death. So.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there's that. And so in doing all this, I guess, I mean, how do you describe your combat experience?
Not a lot of combat experience. So that's kind of what Kilroy Was Here is about. It's about a officer that comes in thinking he's going to leave his mark on Afghanistan and be able to make a difference, but he gets relegated to a squadron desk job. Mm-hmm. And it follows him through the year as he builds this relationship with his interpreter, that it was one of the squadron commander's interpreters that kind of got kicked to the wayside. And he starts to realize over the course of the year that even in this mundane job and often ridiculous job, he can still make a difference by the way he's influencing the people around him. I did have one, I guess.
I was going to say, don't get too far ahead, because I wanted to ask you about anything about the deployment that was sort of significant. Like, was there anything that happened there that stands out to you as a seminal moment for you particularly?
Well, I did towards the end of the deployment. I think it was in October of 09. We left in December. So it was about 2 months before we were going to leave. I was able to go out on a resupply mission. We had a COP down in the district of Kirwar, which was in normal conditions, it was only accessible for resupply by helicopter. So I had spent months resupplying this place by helicopter, but it just happened to be that the road conditions were good enough that the one road in and out we thought was traversable. So we were sending a ground convoy down there, and I was able to go along. We got about halfway to the COP when one of the local nationals' trucks overturned on this narrow road. So we spent a good couple hours while the maintenance platoon tried to pull this thing back up on its wheels. And once we finally got everybody back going, we probably drove about 20 meters, and my truck hit an IED. So it was a command wire IED. So we knew somebody was out there watching. We took all the necessary steps, set up 360 perimeter, tried to get everybody out of the kill zone, even though there wasn't really a kill zone. It was just a hit them and run. The IED was pretty small. We had one guy with a concussion, another guy, the gunner had a separated shoulder, but thank God that was all it was. And then by this time it was after dark, so me and the truck commander that I had been riding with and the maintenance platoon sergeant, we followed the command wire up the hill while we were being covered by the trucks below, but we didn't come across anybody. We got to the end of the wire, which had gone over the top of the crest of a hill, and whoever had blown it had been long gone. But
well, you got your story, I guess, right?
Yeah, and you'll see bits and pieces of that at the in Kilroy Was Here. The guy, I guess, gets a little bit of redemption at the end and gets to experience what he wanted to experience, even though it has a end result that's not quite what he wanted.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know that that's the combat experience you wanted. You'd rather be, staring down the end of your barrel, putting rounds down range, not being on the receiving end of a pop shot IED that could shed shrapnel up your ass. I mean, that's I don't know if that's the combat experience you were looking for or not.
Right. And that's kind of why I wanted to write this book, because I mean, when you think about the literature that's come out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're hearing the exciting stories, the guys that kicked in doors, the guys that are in these crazy firefights, but you don't hear about the countless soldiers that are drafting PowerPoint slides and making sure all the fonts are the same and the transitions aren't too flashy for the commander that's going to be picking them apart. And there's just a lot of ridiculousness that the civilian world doesn't see that I wanted to shed some light on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess while you're there going through all this, do you have any idea that you should start making mental notes? Are you taking notes about your experience there and everything else? Like, when does the actual idea that, hey, I got to write all this shit down, finally hit you?
Well, I remember vividly telling a couple of the other officers in the operations office that nobody would believe this crap if I wrote it in the book. So that's when the idea kind of hit me, like I should write this down. I had been doing a little bit of writing on the side for a number of years, and nothing of any significance, but I knew that was something that I potentially wanted to do. So I started making some notes. I've got tons of green books downstairs that have a few notes in them and quite a few obscene drawings after being left unattended in the operations office. But once I got home, it really kind of hit me that, I could easily fill a novel with this. And it was probably about a year and a half after I got out that I started actually brainstorming in earnest and then writing it out. So
all right. I want to put this on pause because I do want to get to your decision to leave the military. I mean, when you signed up, you wanted to go to war. Obviously you had your 4-year commitment from ROTC. Did you think you were only doing 4 and leaving, or was it because of the path that you took that you said, look, this is not what I thought it was going to be and got out? Like what? So when you get back, what happens?
So I actually made the call while I was over there. I had never really thought of it as being a career thing. It wasn't out of the picture that it would be a career thing. I knew I wanted to serve. I wanted to do 4 years, but there were other things that I wanted to do. So I kind of left it open. But when the knee thing happened and I didn't get the combat experience that a normal platoon leader in a combat arm branch would get, that kind of made the decision for me. About halfway through the deployment, I made the final decision and put in my refrad paperwork, and I ended up having to travel up to a different fob one day to have a meeting with our brigade commander to just kind of like an exit interview. He talked to me about other options, and I did consider them for quite a while. Basically all the way up until the last couple months before I got out, I considered staying in and going to different branches, but I just felt like an armor officer with no combat experience was probably a pretty rare thing at that point. And to go to career course and then take command while having never had combat experience wasn't going to be the greatest thing for anybody.
Did the brigade commander call you son at any point during the conversation? I feel like that's what they do. Son, you've got your whole life ahead of you.
Not that I recall. Pretty sure he offered me an ROTC position somewhere, but there's an exaggerated version of the interview in the book, so you'll have to check it out.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm curious. I just remember that's what my brigade commander said to me when I left active duty for the Guard. Son, you might not want to do this. I'm like, I get it. You're old and I'm young, but we're not related. So, all right. So you make the decision to get out. You said it was until about a year and a half after you'd gotten out that you started to write it down or just started putting it in a book. I mean, clearly you knew it was going to be satirical, so to speak, but did you have an idea of how you wanted Kilroy Was Here to lay out? Like, was it just chronological for you, or how did you end up going about it?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to cover a full deployment. Everything else I had no idea. I'd never done long form writing before, so I started reading books on writing, books by Stephen King and Ray Bradbury and all that good stuff, and just reading in general to try to study the different techniques of different authors. But when I started writing it, I just kind of sat down and went. I thought I would edit most of the stuff I didn't like out later. I ended up starting out, I was trying to follow 3 different characters through this deployment, and it wasn't a good call to try to do that on my first ever novel attempt because it was just too much to keep track of. I ended up getting them 13 chapters in, and I was like, this is garbage. So I switched to the first person perspective and wrote the last, I guess 20 some chapters from the first person perspective. And then for the second draft, I came around and rewrote the first 13 chapters from the first person. And then it all kind of fell into place from there.
I mean, was there anything, obviously your deployment experience is the basis for inspiration, but how much of the book is actually, for lack of a better term, factual? Like there were actually legitimate things that happened that you're actually putting down?
I can't give away the magician's secret.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, I mean,
percentage-wise it?
I would say about 90% in the book, or the events in the book are based in some type of reality. Whether it happened to me on deployment or at Fort Knox, I kind of like picked some pieces from all over the place and integrated it into the story.
What is one of the things from a sort of, satirical side when you talk about the experience of combat? Like, can you give me a couple of examples? Again, I don't want you to give away the whole book because we want people to buy it, but of something that is just so absurd that you think people wouldn't believe when you tell them about your combat experience, or Kilroy Was Here and the combat experience of the character in it.
Well, so in one of the scenes leading up to the IED incident, they're traversing through this small town, and the city is real packed together. So they're having to be very careful, move slowly. They got crowds of people coming around, and the guy hears his gunner up above giggling uncontrollably, and he ends up like pulling on his pant leg, and he's like, what's going on? What is the deal? And he's like, oh, I'm throwing out candy for the kids and blah, blah, blah. And he was like, well, that's really nice. And he's like, well, half of them are laxatives. They're all going to shit their pants. And so that had never happened to me, but I'd heard stories of people doing that on deployment. So the character reams them out. But people just are like blown away when they hear about stuff like that.
I'll always contend one of the toughest missions I ever did was handing out school supplies to Iraqi children. I've never seen people lose their mind over freaking construction paper like ever in your life. I'm being tackled by 7-9-year-olds for a ream of construction paper. And they're pulling on everything on my uniform. They're pulling on my weapon, on my bayonet, like everything every weapon that could have killed me, these kids are tugging on just to get some paper out of my hands. Like, yo, I mean, seriously. I mean, that just, on one hand, you chuckle at it, but on the other hand, it's like, this is like currency to them. It's like legitimate currency for them to hold this stuff. Part of the sort of absurdities of combat, or just the interactions you have with your fellow soldiers. It's not even, the inch here or there that may make the difference in your life. It's not even the, wow, you got so damn lucky kind of deal that the bullet whizzed by your head. But it's just the daily interactions you have with your fellow soldiers that are there doing the same mundane BS every single day. How much of those experiences are not only in the book, but how much do they kind of make up sort of the background for your writing?
A lot, especially in this story, because I mean, it centers around a guy who hardly ever gets to leave the fob. So I'm sure you're familiar with the E4 Mafia.
Yeah.
I'm
second only to the Lieutenant Mafia, by the way. Second only to the Lieutenant Mafia.
I brought the E4 Mafia to life in Kilroy. So there's a lot to do with the politics of the lower enlisted and how they interact with each other. And then one of the main characters in the book is a chaplain who, by a human resources error in the Army, ended up in the chaplain corps instead of the infantry corps. He was a prior enlisted infantry who went through OBC, was supposed to go back into infantry, but ended up being stuck in the chaplain corps. So he's a little bit rough around the edges. And I kind of pulled that character from our own chaplain, who cursed a little bit more than what I assumed a chaplain would do. So I kind of just extrapolated that. But the majority of the book is those relationships that you build with the soldiers around you when you're in such close quarters, and how you as a team kind of deal with the absurdities that come with the atmosphere of war that is just so much outside of normal life that you kind of need that support network to be able to process it all.
Coincidentally enough, I actually deployed in my first deployment with a former 11 Bravo who went to be a chaplain's assistant, whatever that MOS is. And he deployed because he had the secondary MOS of 11 Bravo. He deployed as that, but he was a chaplain's assistant. And it was really weird to watch him make this transition from killer to angel to killer to angel. And it's almost, the schizophrenia by the end of the deployment. I'm like, dude, you need to go take a knee. Like you need to back up. Like, I don't know. And he was like trying to extend to stay for a whole nother year. I'm like, you're a chaplain's assistant, for crying out loud, dude. Settle down. So it's weird that you say that. But, I think the other thing that is prevalent is just sort of those experiences and the bonds that they form from them. We've all got a story about somebody in our unit, somebody in our platoon, whatever it may be, with our section, that always, just stood out to you for whatever given reason. And you always remember that individual, and whether it's a conversation or something that happened or whatever, but do those bonds, how well are they reflected in the book?
I think it's reflected quite well. mostly I tried to zero in on the bond that's formed between the chaplain and the main character, as well as the main character and this interpreter who was kind of shunned by the squadron commander, because this interpreter is a guy who his whole dream is to make enough money to be able to get out of Afghanistan and his family out of Afghanistan and leave that world behind. And the main character at the beginning can't understand that, because he's of the mind that if you want anything to change here and what we're doing here to matter, then people like you need to stay and try to make a difference. And then it kind of ends up flip-flopping views towards the end, where the main character, maybe I shouldn't be giving all this way, but the main character starts to see things from his point of view, but then the interpreter begins to see that like this is his country, and if anything's gonna happen here, then he needs to do something about it. And it's been interesting with the recent stuff in the news with the pullout in Iraq and all Afghanistan, and the news of the interpreters and all the contract workers trying to get out. It's really kind of made me recall that piece of the book, and not so much rethink the way I wrote it, but it definitely makes me think a little bit harder. I guess nobody could predict this outcome. Maybe you could, but
well, you could predict the second outcome, the outcome that is after we leave. That's very predictable. But you mentioned the interpreter. I had an amazing relationship with my interpreter, and it's one of those things. Like, I was around my terp probably more than most of my soldiers on every given day, because I couldn't function without him, right? Like, I'm training the Iraqi army and I needed him there literally to tell me everything, what they were saying. And so, we spent a lot of time together, post meetings and everything else. And it's really hard to describe how that bond forms. I would joke with my interpreter so much. We're still friends on Facebook. He left Iraq shortly after I did. He just managed to get out and he went to Europe. I don't know how he got out there, but he did. And I'm happy for him. But, we had such a great relationship that I could joke with him a lot. One of the things that the Iraqis would always say, I think I've told this story before, but, inshallah, right? If God wills it, was what they would always say. And we were talking about, I forget the circumstances of what we were talking about, but it was about them being someplace at some time, and he looked at me and said, well, it's up to the God. And I looked at him and I said, which God, your God or my God? And he said, sir, there is only one God. I said, no. There's your God and there's my God. My God has me on time where I'm supposed to be. Your God certainly doesn't get anybody there where they're supposed to be. So which God are you talking about? Your God or my God? Sir, there is only one God. He couldn't wrap his head around the joke for like 15 minutes. It's stuff like that stands out to me. But we had that sort of relationship back and forth, where that's probably not very PC to say now in these days. But nonetheless, we had that kind of relationship where we could laugh about it. But those, with all the news, it is very personal now. I'm glad my terp is out, but I certainly understand all the people back here who were fighting for their interpreters to have a better life, because they were just as much at risk as we are every single day. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't go on any mission without my terp. And they didn't even give him a gun. He just sat there with this mini little body armor vest and a Kevlar. It's like, that whole experience, that whole relationship and that experience is sort of very germane to the combat experience for most of us, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I always felt like the interpreter relationship was kind of like the little brother relationship, where they kind of got like picked on by the unit a little bit, but it was because they loved them. And there was definitely that bond that formed over time, especially with the ones that ended up going above and beyond. And it's like anything. It's like the basic training experience. I mean, you can single out who's going to be the good above and beyond interpreter, and who's going to be the one that runs for the hills within the first couple of weeks of working with them. But we ended up being lucky. I know that our companies had some really good interpreters, and I still see messages from them between some of our guys on Facebook to this day. So
anything, I assume that a book, much like a movie, goes through an editing process. Anything that was sort of taken out of the book, or in retrospect, wish you had put in the book that wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, you always end up killing some of your babies when you go through the editing process. None that I can think of that I was too heartbroken about. The editing process was actually fairly smooth. One of my best friends from home served as a beta reader for me, so he helped me clean it up before I ended up sending it off to an editor. And then when it came back from the editor, he only had minor changes for me to make, so I didn't have to cut too much. I was pretty critical when I went from my first draft to my second draft, so there wasn't a lot that was left in there that was fluff.
Did you have a preset publisher for this, or you kind of wrote it and then pitched it to everybody?
I pitched it to a lot of people.
What was that process like?
That was long and painful. So I had to research agencies first. My goal, or my process, was I was going to pitch to agents. If I couldn't find an agent to take it up, I was going to pitch to smaller publishers. And then if I couldn't find a publisher to pick it up, I was going to pitch to, or just self-publish it and promote it myself. So I ended up pitching to a lot of agents. For being a first-time novelist, I had a good number of people who asked for the full manuscript, which any writer will tell you is a good sign, but it doesn't mean you're going to get there. But what I was told by all the agents was that war novels were kind of a tired genre at that point. And they were telling me they didn't know how they would sell it. So once I got through all the agents, that was probably about a 9-month process, because there's just such a long waiting period between submission and hearing back. And a lot of times you don't hear back at all. Yeah. So I ended up submitting to a bunch of publishers, and then I found A15 Publishing, which is run by retired Lieutenant Colonel Pete Donnelly. And it's centered completely around veteran stories. And he asked for the full manuscript, and it wasn't too long after that he gave me the go-ahead that we were going to do it. So if you get a chance, you should check out A15 Publishing. They've got a lot of good stuff up there. The guy who is one of the main editors for Coffee or Die magazine actually published one of his books through them about the 75th Rangers and all of their actions through Iraq and Afghanistan.
When you finally get this thing green-lighted to go, what's kind of the emotion and the feeling in the whole thing?
Relief. I spent the better part of probably 7 years writing this thing and editing this thing and paying for an editor. So there was a lot of love into this thing. And I was fully prepared to do the self-publishing, but that wasn't necessarily the way I wanted to go, especially because I want to make this a career. For the next book, it would be much better to be able to say I had a publisher backing my previous book than to be Joe Schmo who just pasted it up on Amazon and prayed that somebody would be gullible enough to click on it. So, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with self-publishing, but there's definitely more weight behind having a publisher behind you.
What were some of your closest friends and fellow soldiers' reactions when they read it?
So I've got a very good reaction from all the guys from my old unit. A lot of them have thanked me for putting this stuff on paper. They recognize a lot of the events and a lot of the characters in it. And I haven't had a negative word yet from anybody I served with about it.
Well, that's good. You mentioned how the reaction was that, war movies and war books have been inundated. There's too many of them. And they're sort of our parents' and grandparents' Westerns, right? Like John Wayne made 800 Westerns, in the 50s and 60s. That's what post 9/11 war movies have become, right? I mean, there's just so many of them out there. And I'm super critical of them all, just because of the experience that I had. And I get that Hollywood takes liberties, to make a movie, but different discussion. Where I was going with all this was, as I was off on my tangent, you talk so much about how all these movies and these books paint anybody in uniform out to be a hero. And that's such a dangerous term that we throw around. And the hero worship of soldiers now it's literally like teetering, on a very slim ledge. When you choose to write a story that's not about a hero, which again seems like almost like a layup, and I don't want to denigrate anybody who's wrote a book about a hero, but it's easy to write a Tom Cruise movie. Like, he wins in the end, right? There's nothing. Go find me the Tom Cruise movie where he's a loser, right? I mean, it follows a certain path. Was part of your goal in this to sort of take some not so subtle shots at that idea that everybody in uniform is a hero?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I actually, the author's note at the beginning of the book talks about how it's not the intention of the book to downgrade or dispel the notion of, or not dispel the notion, but not to like downplay the service of any veteran, but to just kind of recognize that we're all people too. And that it takes all kinds to make up the military, just like it takes all kinds to make up the civilian life. And it was definitely my intention to kind of shed some light on that, just because you come back from a deployment in Afghanistan doesn't mean you were out kicking in doors and you saw some crazy stuff. I mean, there's plenty of people that deploy and they come home and they get out and they just carry on with their normal life. I mean, I feel like that's kind of what I did. And I'm proud of what I did. I wear my American flag tank top on 4th of July, just like anybody else. But I agree with you that this kind of like hero worship thing has gotten a little bit out of control. And I think it just kind of plays into our society that has developed through social media being kind of like a look at me society. And we as veterans, I think, need to do a better job of policing ourselves. I mean, I see a lot of stuff on Facebook that's very like self-glorifying from old vets who are Afghan and Iraq vets who post things that I guess I would classify as self-praising, and I don't know if that's so much them wanting to brag about it as it is like them, that's their glory days, and they want to get that out there and relive that and have that recognized, which I think can be dangerous because you spend too much time living in the past and you don't propel yourself forward.
Well, and the other thing that has happened is, along with this sort of, civilian side worship of the military and adulation of the military, it now becomes a shield. You play the veteran card real quick and all of a sudden it's, don't go there, we must respect them. And I'm with you. Look, I'm not denigrating anybody's service. I'm not denigrating anything anybody did. But just because we put on a uniform doesn't make us immune to criticism or better than anybody else. Hey, I mean, true story. I did plenty of crazy stuff in Iraq. You know what else I did? Got a hold of some booze, got drunk and puked all over my bed one night. I mean, we do the same things. We're just in different circumstances. And some people have done some very extraordinary things in very dire and extreme circumstances. And those things are great. They deserve all the praise that's out there. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of dumb shit that's happened. And we've talked about a lot of it on this podcast with people. So I personally, and this is just Mark speaking, personally, it's one of those things where I get very nervous now anytime veterans are attached to anything outside the veteran space and outside the military space, because I think there's all of a sudden a sort of what's in it for me and a how can I profit off of this? How can I commercialize this? How can I use the military for my benefit? And there's a huge part of me that still wishes to this day that everybody would leave us alone and let us go back to doing what we do under the cloak of, hey, the Army's there. We just know they got our back, and leave it at that. But in fairness, we can't operate that way because we're a taxpayer-funded institution, right? We owe the government and the people transparency and clairvoyancy on who we are and how we go about our business for the most part, right? Generally, we owe them that. And because we've dealt with so much smut recently through a variety of different issues, we owe them more transparency now than ever before, but that comes at a price, at a very big price. And if you've ever been on military Twitter, and I'm sure you have, it's a pretty gross place to be at times.
Twitter in general is a pretty gross place to be at times.
That goes without saying, yes. But, military Twitter is particularly one of the worst forms of cannibalism I've ever seen.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
So anyway, I'm done opining. So you also wrote a couple of other short stories after the book. Well, before I get to the short stories, were you surprised at how successful the book was when it first came out?
Yeah, I'm still getting there. So we had a great launch, and it's been doing pretty steady numbers it's only been out for about 6 months now. So it's been doing pretty steady numbers, and it's continuing to grow this summer, especially. Word's been getting out. This podcast is definitely going to help. Last week, I gave a 40-minute presentation at the USS Silverside about the book and about topics related to the book. And then I've had a couple other blurbs in the news, so I'm hoping that will continue to push it forward. It just being with a smaller publisher, it takes a while to get the ball rolling, and I foresee nothing but good things so far, and I keep harassing celebrities on Twitter to try to get them to retweet my tweets about the book.
So what was the other impetus for the other short stories that you have written? One of them, let me get the names here. Oh Dark 30, right? And where is it? Where are my notes? Help me out here. You wrote the damn thing. The Kilroy War.
So the Kilroy War was actually posted on Zero Dark 30, which is part of the Veterans Writing Project. And that I actually wrote simultaneously while I was writing the novel, because I felt like I needed a better understanding of the main antagonist. So I wrote a short story around his backstory. So that I went through the process with that. I wrote it, had actually my old high school English teacher volunteered to edit it for me. And then I started submitting that around, and it got picked up by Zero Dark 30 and posted on their website. And then I made it available on Amazon after that. But if anybody who's read the book wants a little bit better understanding about Nasir, the main bad guy in the story, you can go and check that out. The other short story is called Post. And I wrote that kind of in a little flash of emotion after one of the many mass shootings that has happened over the last couple of years. I can't even recall which one prompted it, but it's basically follows a guy who hears about a mass shooting in his town, and his reaction is immediately to go start posting on social media about it and the aftermath that follows that. So it's kind of just exploring it's a little bit cynical look at our reactions to such major events nowadays.
I was going to say, sort of a dramatic pivot from what Kilroy Was Here is, lighthearted and funny, and you get the opposite end of the spectrum with that.
Yeah, I wrote that in, like I said, it was a little bit of emotion behind that, and I ended up getting done, and I kind of thought about not posting it or putting it up for a little while, but I ended up feeling like it was good enough to go up there. So,
what's the hardest part about writing a book?
Finding the time. So I have a full-time job as a paralegal for my friend's law firm. My wife is a elementary school principal, and we have a son that's 8 years old and a daughter that's 5 years old. So most of my writing time happens when everybody else in the house is unconscious. So I get up early a lot of days. I stay up late a lot of days. Is run by when I took the job was that any time I wasn't engaged in firm business, I was able to work on my writing. So that's been a huge factor in being able to finish Kilroy Was Here, and I'm about halfway through the third draft of my next novel. So
Need to send you some melatonin for the kids, man. Works like a charm.
We have some, don't worry.
Okay. I got twin 5-year-old boys, so melatonin is in full ready supply in my house. Anytime I need to knock them out, just bam. It's a wonderful thing. So you're starting to write the second book, as you just mentioned. Can you cue us into a little bit about what it's about and where you're going with it?
Yeah, so I'm from Michigan, so it is set in a small town in Michigan, and this town has a mayor that's been mayor for like 40 some years, and then he all of a sudden dies mysteriously, and the story centers around the contentious mayoral election that stems from that, kind of playing off from current political climate of hardcore left versus hardcore right. And then I also bring in some of the legend of the Michigan Dog Man that not many people know about. It's kind of like a werewolf / Beast of Bray Road kind of legend. And there's a celebrity monster hunter that comes to town to try to help solve the deaths that are happening around town.
I would, let me ask you, when does it due out? Do you know? Have you gotten a timeline for it yet?
I'm hoping to have it off to an editor before the end of the year, which means that it'll probably be late next summer before I'm even submitting to agents and publishers. So it'll be a little while.
Gotcha. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, just because you were there with the pullout of Afghanistan. And I'm sure, I know your combat experience is a little bit limited, but you certainly have friends who didn't have that experience. Have you had conversations with them about thoughts and feelings on the whole thing, and where are you with it personally?
Yeah. Most of the guys I've talked to, they're kind of in the same boat that I am, that it's just kind of about time. I mean, the war there felt stagnant when we were there in 2009. We were, even then, our mission was to put Afghans in the lead. We were always running missions with the ANP and the ANA, and it just doesn't sound like things have improved much since then. It feels like we've just kind of been treading water for the last 10 years. And pretty much everybody's that I've talked to's consensus is, if we're not making any headway, what are we still doing?
Yeah, no, that's fair. I'm sure that, you have had friends who have dealt with this, but, sort of the after effects of war, even for you, I mean, you're not immune to any of this stuff by any stretch of the imagination, just because you didn't, have this grand combat experience. But what's post-war life been like for you in the mindset and some of your fellow comrades who have served? I mean, do you guys spend a lot of time talking about this, or?
Some. That's actually what part of my talk was about last week. Was a lot of folks, when they hear about PTSD and veteran suicide and depression, they immediately think of veterans who've seen high levels of combat, who've just seen awful things and can't get around it, lost friends and whatnot. But I mean, there's a lot of folks that go through that type of depression just because of the separation from the military. When you get out, it's a complete 180 in lifestyle. I mean, it requires a rewiring of your brain almost. I remember how long it took me to stop saying Roger, like, to everything in the affirmative. And like, you'd have to joke about things differently. You can't say the same things in the civilian workforce that you can say in the military workforce. I mean, I guess I don't know if that's rings true today, but 10 years ago.
Sure it does. Nobody uses the word behoove in the regular world.
Right? So
nobody uses behoove, nobody moves, shoots, and communicates.
Yeah. So you get out and you've got this identity that you've attached yourself to for, I mean, a minimum of the last 4 years, and you're this entirely separate person, and now you're expected to change to fit in with this civilian life, as we call it, and you lose that piece of yourself, and you try to fill that vacuum with like a new job, and a new family, whatever your life course is. And a lot of times that new job is not as rewarding as that old job you had or that old identity you had. And I feel like that's something that isn't talked about a lot when addressing veteran depression, is that transition period not being a combat experience related, but being just that separation from that old identity, and being able to make your civilian life something that you deem as important as what you deemed your military life.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, the only mafia that people in the civilian world know is the one that my ancestors ran, the Italian. There's no E4 or lieutenant mafia that anybody in the civilian world knows what the hell you're talking about. And I agree. I mean, the transition is an incredibly tough part. I'm glad we are where we are with it now. I'm glad that we're better about it. I'm glad that mental health is starting to receive, the focus that it needs. As a matter of fact, I just ran into a guy who's still on active duty who they released to an outpatient program for his TBI while he's on active duty. Like, he didn't go to the government. He went to a nonprofit agency that specializes in TBI. And that tells you leaps and bounds. I mean, either they would have medically discharged him and said, see you, go figure it out on your own. Or, they would have sent him to an Army doctor to misdiagnose him, much like your knee. That said, I just think it speaks to where we are and what 20 plus years of combat have done to an organization right now that frankly is struggling to find which way is up, and between that and wokeness in the military, if that's a thing, and oh, by the way, mandatory vaccines now and that. I mean, it's just we have combat seems to be the easiest part of what we've done in reality, right? Like, and you chuckle, but it's honestly true.
Yeah.
If you could just send us to war and leave us there, it's like, okay, we got all that part down. It's just everything else that surrounds it, that tends to make it much more difficult than it already is. So, anything about the military you miss?
Yeah, I miss the structure, and I've tried to maintain it as much as I possibly can.
Have your kids standing at attention for breakfast or what? I mean,
I make them do push-ups if they fall out of line. That's my go-to punishment.
Is there like a whistle and kids come running down for chow?
I haven't got him in the front yard doing flutter kicks yet.
Okay, well, I want video when it happens. I want to see it on Twitter.
No, I mean, I still get up every morning at like 5:30 and work out, and that's been the key for me to keep working on my writing, is to maintain the discipline, because without that, I'd probably be sitting on the couch eating a bag of Doritos every night and be about 300 pounds. So I miss a lot of the structure, but I've tried to integrate that into my daily life, and I miss the camaraderie. I made some of the best friends I'll ever make in my life at Fort Knox and Fort Drum. So I would say those two things are the biggest things for me.
Is there anything that keeps you up at night about the wartime experience? I mean, is there a part of you that still wonders, sort of, could I have hacked it, in legitimate combat? Does that bother you at all?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but I find myself returning to that every once in a while and dwelling on it for some time. You always got the what could have been scenario, and I mean, things played out the way they did, perhaps by divine plan, so I'm not going to question it. But yeah, I mean, if you're a combat arms officer, I think you always wish that you had the same stories to tell as everybody else. But I made to learn to make a pretty good batch of coffee, and I got pretty good at PowerPoint slides. So it's
any use for PowerPoint slides in the legal world, or no?
Not really.
No. It's a skill that totally got wasted once you left the military.
The presentation I gave last week, I had to come up with a slideshow for it, and I was like, I got this. So.
Yeah, it's funny too. In over 20 years, I still suck at it. Like, I am so basic. I ended up doing COVID response for 10 months for the National Guard here in Georgia, and I had to brief the 1- and 2-star general every week, and I literally had to get a lieutenant to do the slides for me. She was out, she could move. So I'm like watching her do this, and I'm mesmerized at how quick she can move everything and make it bigger. I'm like, did you go to a class for this that I missed over the last 20 years? But yeah, there are apparently people like you on staff who all they do is make you PowerPoint slides, and they know everything about it. And I was just never that guy.
I remember one operations brief we had over there when the SIGO had inserted some animation into his slide where a little plane came and did a circle around the PowerPoint.
And the whole room went,
the whole room just was silent, and the SCO just lit him up.
He got in trouble for it?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Rip them apart.
Oh, see, I give creative points for that. See, I'm the anti-officer. I'm the anti-colonel. That's pretty cool. So you got lit up for it? Oh man. See, you uptight combat arms officers, they don't know how to laugh at anything. You guys are so serious all the time. Worried about your spurs.
What? Hey, you don't knock the spurs. I got them on the wall downstairs.
Do you? You still got them?
Oh yeah, I got my Stetson and my spurs mounted down there.
It's a thing with you Cav guys. You just leave that Stetson out where everybody can obnoxiously see it.
Oh yeah.
It's not like in a box in a closet. It is on display on the wall, with nothing within 6 feet of it.
I have a ring around the inside of my Stetson. It's a stain from Yingling beer, because at the first stable call I went to at Fort Drum, I had to chug an entire Stetson full of Yingling as a punishment for missing some line of the Cavalry poem. Or no, it was because I had 2 last names. That's what I had, or 2 first names. That's what I had.
Oh, dear Lord. You kind of date yourself with chugging Yingling. It used to be popular back in the day. It's kind of lost a little bit of its luster.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's right up there at Rolling Rock.
Yep.
Or Pennsylvania beers. Terrible. So, well, look, I mean, again, the book is called Kilroy Is Here. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it anywhere else, right? I mean, it's not hard to find.
Yeah. So a lot of the smaller bookstores, you'll have to ask for it, but they're going to order it in. It's available through most of the big distributors that they use. So,
well, if you're going to go to Amazon, make sure you go to hazardground.com first and then click on Amazon. So Brett gets a win and we get a win as well. But again, look forward to the next novel. Check out the short stories as well. You have your own website for people who want to check out your stuff. Hogwashwriting.com, correct?
Yes. Yep. So there's not a whole lot new up there. There's a lot of ridiculous stuff that I've just been kind of writing over the last couple of years. But it gives kind of a good sample of what my writing style is. There's also links to the book up there and some info on some of the veteran charities that I'm going to try to donate to with any proceeds I make from the book. So,
well, again, continued success. I hope the book continues to do well and takes off. Again, just an amazing sort of look at combat from a lens that everybody who's worn a uniform definitely understands, but those who never have would get a kick out of understanding this side of combat and this side of deploying downrange. So fantastic work. Certainly appreciate it. Great to connect with you, brother. Wishing you nothing but the best for you and your family, man. And thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate you having me on. It's been a great time talking with you.
You don't have to call me sir. It's okay. I'm not that high.
I call everybody sir.
For Brett Allen, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Killcliff's Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.